Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm a Principal Microsoft Technical Trainer, and I'm excited to be your guide to module number 3, Scaling Apps in Azure App Services, which is part of the learning path about the App Services Platform as a Service. We're going to take a focus at one of the features of the App Service that allows you to scale that application as required as part of the App Service Plan, and we talked about this in the other recordings. The App Service Plan is a unit of compute that is regionally based. Inside of that App Service Plan is the App Service where your application is going to run. And through that, we're going to be able to scale this out and back in, creating more instances of that resource. We're also going to demonstrate the ability to scale it up and down, giving more resources to that specific instance. So we'll be describing both of those as we go through this. So the autoscaling is going to not just adjust the numbers, that scaling out and scaling in. I'm going to add to that the ability to scale it up and scale it down, because remember, not all app service plans supported this scaling capabilities. And we'll take a look at the various types of scaling that we have, whether it be autoscaling. I'm going to go through a complex set of rules to determine how to work with them. I'm going to show you some recommended practices, and then we'll take a look at the manual scaling features as well. The benefit, especially in a microservice model, is the ability to autoscale factors based around either predicted growth, maybe around times of the year where you see you're going to be busy, or maybe days of the week, as well as also be able to accommodate unexpected activities. I used in a previous recording, maybe your product that you sell is all of a sudden on some celebrity's favorite list, and now you get millions of users coming to your website. You often hear, oh, the website crashed. Well, it didn't crash. You just ran out of the number of resources to handle that excess traffic that you're working with. And by having microservices, we're now going to be able to scale the very specific part of your application requirements to be able to scale to meet that need, as opposed to in the monolithic model, being able to having to scale the entirety of the application, whether all those features were used or not. And remember, we talked about having in the App Service Plan, which is the unit of scaling, you can have more than one application. And I talked about in that case, if you had more than one application in the App Service Plan, all the apps in the App Service Plan would then scale, even if only one of the apps needed it. And that's why you'll see in a lot of cases, there is a one-to-one relationship. One App Service Plan has one app service in it, which has one piece of code running. So we'll take a look at these different types of scaling. I'm going to go off and talk about it for a few minutes. I'm going to do a demonstration of deploying it, and I'm going to come back to the scaling criteria and detail some of the features that I'll show you in the build of it and what their implication is. So I've moved to the application. In this case, it's the App Service Plan. And I've got multiple apps in that App Service Plan. So we're going to take a look at that scaling up and the scaling out feature, which is going to control when and how the App Service Plan and the apps inside of it are going to scale. We talked about scaling up and scaling down, not really the focus of this module, but this is the ability to have the plan that is going to allocate the compute resources as well as the feature sets. We've talked about this. Daily backups, and here's that scaling capability. You'll see that some plans are manually scaled, some plans are based on rules. Now, this would be an example of an eye-winking moment that I mentioned in the introduction to this entire course. This kind of chart is something that you might want to remember, because you might get a question that says you currently have X number of something and you need to be able to get, X plus this number. So you have maybe currently you have 5 deployment slots and you need to go to 20 deployment slots. And they'll give you the criteria of where you are and you need to have those more deployment slots. What might you do? Well, to get from 5 deployment slots to more, we see that the staging slots, we can have 20 for our premiums. But in our standard, we have 5. So if you have a standard plan and you need to get to 20 slots, you have to move from a standard plan to a premium, would be an example of that eye-winky moment. But in here, we see that we have also that scaling capability. So I want to talk about that scaling. If your plan doesn't support it, you can scale the plan up by just changing the plan that supports that level of scaling. And then you're going to be able to then perform the second feature, which is what the focus of this module is the scaling out capabilities. On the scaling out, You can see that I can manually scale this where I can determine how many instances that I want to work with. Currently I have 1, and depending on the plan, I can scale up to 10. And if I needed more than 10, I would have to scale the plan up to accommodate the greater number of units that I'm working with. I'm going to just bring this back and I'm going to go to the rules base, because this is where I think the real power of this is to create not a manual requirement, but when you're not around, it can just monitor for the usage of something and then be able to scale to meet that need. So I'm going to go through and build a scaling rule. Now, we have a set of conditions that we're working with. So I'm going to come into a custom rule condition, and I can now have a default condition that I'm working with. I'm going to go through and change this name, and I'm going to call this metric. It is one of the characteristics that you can use as a metric, some numerical value, whether it be compute, memory usage, network throughput, data disks, transfer rates, whatever these metrics are. I'll show some of them to you. On this metric triggering, I want to scale based around that response. So I'm going to call this rule a metric. And then within the scaling, and the term I'll use is called a condition. So I'm going to call this condition 1, metric as condition 1. So I want to scale this based on a metric. It is strongly recommended, and you'll see this come up on a slide as the Microsoft recommendations, that you set a minimum, a maximum, and a default. So I could have a minimum of 1, a maximum of maybe 10, and maybe I'm going to have a default of 2. So by default, or you'll see in the documentation, they refer to this as pre-staging the number of units that you need. So I want 2 that I'm working with. And then I can create a set of scaling rules. Another strong Microsoft recommendation is that you build a minimum of 2 rules, a rule to scale it out and a rule to scale it back in. So I'm now going to pick the metric that I want, so I can have a standard metric. And here's all those different kind of metrics, data in, data out. So you can pick from a wide variety of numerical values that you could quantify to determine when you want a scaling condition to take place. So I'm just going to pick CPU. It's one that most people would understand. I then get my operators. Greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. This is bringing you back to your grade 10 math. I think you would hopefully all understand the difference of greater than and equal to. So I'm going to select greater than or equal to 70% for a duration of 10 minutes in a fine grain time interval of 1 minute. I'm going to draw this all out for you in a minute here. I want a average, a minimum, a maximum, a count, a sum. So whatever you want from a numerical value. Do I want an average number over that period of time? Or if it hits a maximum number, so what is the minimum, the maximum during that period of time? And what is the time aggregate of an average? And then what is the operation that I want? I want to increase the count by 1. Now I'm going to come back to this term called cooldown in just a few minutes. So there's my scaling out rule. So scale out when this app service has a minimum CPU usage greater than or equal to 70%, increase 1. The Microsoft recommendation is to have at least 2 rules, one to scale it back in. So I'm going to go back to less than or equal to, I'm going to say 50%, and I'm picking that number very specifically. So I want to talk about this. And what I've just done is going to create what's called a race condition, something I don't want to do. And I'm going to get to the whiteboard and cover this one in just a minute. So now what I want to do is decrease the count by 1. So you think you've done your job. Things are pretty good. I want to describe what has just happened here and some pros and cons of what it is that you're going to be doing. And this will all be summarized on the final screen of this recording. So what I've just done, a minimum of 1, a maximum of 10, and I've got a default of 2. So I currently have 2, and it's 11:15. We said that if we were greater than or equal to 70% for a 10-minute time grain, so there's my 10-minute walking window, measured on 1-minute intervals. So this is 11:16, 11:17. I'm not going to fill them all in. 11:24, 11:23. So each of these, so measured over 1 minute intervals for a 10-minute period, I had to be greater than or equal to 70%, and then I was going to add 1. So let's say I was at 0%, I was at 100%, I was at 50%, I was at 60%, I was at 90%, I was at 80%, 70%, 30%, 100%, 100%. If that average of that 10-minute interval was greater than or equal to 70%, I will add 1. So at 11:25, I would add 1 if it was over 70%, now giving me 3 units. What happens is throughout this time interval, the green 10-minute window, has been moving along. So every minute it then ticks over, and now it's going to, in this case, 11:26. If I'm still at 100%, that 10-minute window from 11:16 to 11:26 is still greater than or equal to 70%. Theoretically, that would trigger another scaling event at 11:26, adding 1 more unit. That's not the case. The cooldown, that number that I pointed out, what that says is for that cooldown period, which in this case is 5 minutes, I'm going to draw this as a red. For that 5-minute period, up to 11:30, no scaling activity will take place until the cooldown period passes. So it won't be until, I'll go back into my green here, we're at 11:25 or 11:20. So this is 11:20 now. This is going to 11:30. Then and only then, if I'm greater than or equal to 70%, will it then go through another scaling activity. So understanding all those pieces. Now, app services in app service plans spin up nearly instantaneously. They happen very, very quickly, in a matter of seconds. Now, you're going to see in another recording later on, we're going to take a look at standard VMs deployment. Now, it takes a while for a VM to come up, and the same conditions and the same criteria can be used for the scaling of a virtual machine. And so this is going to be more important to that as opposed to app service plans because of the time it takes to spin these resources up. But it's also now going to stop a thing called a race condition. So I want to change this. I'm going to say at greater than or equal to 70%, instead of adding 1, I'm going to say I want to add 2. So now, in that original condition, I've got 2 as my default. At 11:25, I'm going to add 2, which is now going to give me 4. Let's say for whatever condition or whatever reason, for the next 5 minutes, it drops to 0. Maybe I don't need any more. Maybe it drops a little bit less. Maybe it's brought it down because now I've got 4 of them working. Now they're only at like 40% busy, 40% busy, 40%. So whatever that is, but let's say now that 10-minute window is no longer greater than or equal to 70%, but let's say it's now 40%. I had 2 machines that were over 70% busy. So let's imagine if I had 4 versions of my app now, and I had 2 of them and they were at 70%. I then add 2, let's say no additional traffic come in, that would be at 35%, 35%, 35%, 35%. I've accommodated the extra traffic based around the rule, but guess what's now happened? Remember my cooldown said if it was less than or equal to 50%, remove 2. And if that was the rule, then at 11:30, I would remove those 2, which would immediately put that traffic back on the remaining 2, driving them up for the next 5 minutes so that they're now over 70%. And that's that race condition I was talking about. So make sure that these values that you put in for when to scale it out and when to scale it back in, the number that we scale on is not going to create some of these overlaps, that they're going to respond in the timely manner that you're expecting for. But all of these are considerations that you might want to take for the creation of your app services plans and the scaling that you have for it. Now I'm going to go back to the portal, and I want to show you a couple of other features that are going to come up. So now I've got another method that if I've got one and I add one, I've doubled my numbers. I'm looking pretty smart. But if I've got two now and they're both overconsumed, I add one, I've added another one, so I've got three. It's better, but it's maybe not perfect, especially as we start getting into larger numbers. So it would be another recommendation potentially to create more than one scaling rule. Our recommendations have two, one to scale out, one to scale back in. But I'm going to say you might also want to have multiple rules to scale out. So I'm going to add another rule to scale out when it's greater than or 70%. So I'm going to use the same criteria from a metric perspective, but now I'm going to say increase instead of account by, I want to increase a percent by, let's say 10%. And you'll notice that what it does is it puts two rules in here, that when it's greater than 70%, add one, or when it's over 70%, add 10%. What this does is it matches from a business perspective what your requirements are as these numbers start to get bigger, especially as we get into virtual machines that could have up to 1,000 virtual machines. When I have one and I add one, I've got two. I look pretty smart. But if I got 500 and I'm only adding one, I'm not looking so brilliant anymore. So by adding that 10% number, at 20, it's going to say add one, or do I add 10% of 20, which is two? It's going to give me the greater of these numbers. So this is a bit of an eye-winking moment, not just from an exam perspective. The Microsoft rules around scaling is they will never under provision. If there's ever a condition or a rule that has a number and another condition or rule that has another number, whatever is the greater number will be the one that gets picked. And I'm going to show that out over multiple conditions. So at 1, it'll add 1, or 10% of 1 is 0.1. I'm not going to do that. At 20, it's going to add 1 or 2. It's going to pick 2. At 30, it's going to pick 3. At 40, it's going to pick 4. So by adding that second scale out condition, you've met future growth requirements without having to be notified that you're not going to meet the requirements and you're over consuming those resources and you need to maybe come in and change the rule to add more numbers. So that was adding rules to a condition. Now I can have multiple conditions, and I'm going to do that right now. I can now have another condition. Now look what it did. When I created the other condition, it put me back into my metric condition number 1. I'm going to add another condition here. I'm going to call this DOW, day of the week, and I'm going to call this condition 2. I'm going to still scale this on a metric, or I can scale it based on a specific instance counts, but I think metric is more what we're looking for. And I can do a very similar thing. I could create my scale out and my scale in rules to meet the requirements that I'm looking for. So greater than or equal to 70%. I can add my second Bob rule of adding it based on a percentage. And then I'm going to scale it back in. And I'm going to correct my first mistake. I'm going to say scale it back in, and I'm going to pick an appropriate number because 50% probably was too close to my scale out condition, creating that race condition. I'm going to scale when it's less than or equal to, I'm going to say maybe 30%. And then I'm going to decrease my count by 2. So now I've got a condition for day of the week. And so now I can come down here, specify the start and end times, or repeat for a specific day. So if I'm a Monday to Friday shop, I could scale out based around a need for Monday to Friday. So doing a condition day of the week. I'm going to add one because maybe I'm a retail operation, busy most days Monday to Friday, but we're coming up on Black Friday, which is a big shopping day for most of the people in the world nowadays. That is usually based around the third Thursday in November. So now I'm going to create another scale condition for day of the year. And if I click to edit this, it puts me back up in that metric condition number 1. I've got to scroll back down and I'm going to call this DOY, or day of the year, and this is going to be condition 3. I'm not going to go through and create the rules. You should, but I'm going to show you that you can now specify very specific dates. And as I said, Black Friday is the 4th Thursday in November. So the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, the 4th, and it typically goes through to maybe Cyber Monday. So I want to go through to the 1st. And now I could create a scaling condition that had rules that I've got 3 conditions, one for a metric, one for a day of the year, and one for a day of the week that you're working with. Now I'm going to go back to my whiteboard. So if I have my 3 conditions, and that was a metric, I have condition number 2, which is the day of the week, and condition number 3, which is the day of the year. I had rules to scale out, and I had rules to scale back in. Now, if my condition was at the metric level, it's say the 3rd Thursday of November. Thursday is a day that has a metric number. Let's say the numbers are at, say, 20%. My default here was to give me 2, and if it's greater than or equal to 70%, increase. But so I'm going to get 2 units at this time. Maybe my condition down here is I'm going to have my minimum is 1, my default was 10, and the max might be 30. So now what I have is I had default of 2 for here. The day of the week was maybe a default of 4. In this case, 2 versus 4, the day of the week would win. And if the numbers ever go above 70% and it could give me more than 4, this one would start to take over as the metric. But if my default here is for 30 for the 3rd Thursday, if it's the 3rd Thursday, which is a day of the week, which says give me 4 to a maximum of a specific number, you're always going to get the most number based on the rules within a condition, and then across all the conditions will create the most numbers that you're dealing with. And if one says you should scale in because we're below a certain percentage, but I've got a maximum number for something else that says based on the day of the week or the day of the year, the most resources are going to be always what's being provisioned for you. Now, all of that is going to be covered in the course material, so I want to just go back and quickly cover for you to catch up. So when you take a look at enabling scaling factors, you want to take a look at the best type of resources. What is the current demand you're dealing with? You have the scaling in and the scaling out. You want to have a scaling rule for each and every one of the conditions that you're working with. And I would make the recommendation from a scaling out perspective, you might want to have 2 conditions, one based on a hard number and one that's going to be based on a percentage. We talked about the scaling up versus the scaling down. Now, if you're at one user at 90% capacity or 100% capacity, adding another unit, depending on the type of application you're working with, scaling out to another instance might not help you. Let's say it's a single-threaded application. That application is 100% consumed by that single thread. Adding another application isn't going to meet that need. So in there, you might want to scale up the resources. Maybe it's only 1 CPU with only 1 gig of RAM. Maybe you need to go to 4 CPUs with more memory. So getting the metrics back from the application performance, you might want to scale the application up, not just based on the features, based on the resources and the usage of them by the application. So understand the difference between scaling up and scaling in and out. We talked about auto scaling. We have manual scaling that you're dealing with. Our auto scaling, you can have conditions that you're working with, and those conditions, you can have multiple conditions that you can then define. I gave you, you can have it based on a metric, and you can see that on the right part of the screen. So you can scale it based around any specific metric that you're looking for. Now, I'm going to show you in the module on monitoring that we have a thing called application insights. You can actually take a look at your application, not just CPU utilization. Maybe you're a bank and you're looking at the number of loan applications. So the number of loan applications coming in. You can look at a performance metric of the application itself and not just things like the standard metrics of memory and CPU and network throughputs that you're working with. So auto-scaling, scaling in and out, and have multiple conditions, as I said, for day of the week and the day of the year and a metric that you're working with, and then understand the rules that we will never under-provision amongst the rules within a condition and in a multi-condition environment across all of the conditions, what's ever going to get you the most resources. We showed you that not all tiers support auto-scaling. We saw that some don't provide scaling at all, some provide only manual scaling and the auto-scaling. And then the number of resources that you can scale to is going to depend on the app service plan itself. Now remember, if multiple apps are in the app service plan, if one application is running away and you over-consuming, the entire app service plan will scale, requiring all of the applications. Even though they might not be consumed, they will also scale in addition to the application that was using up all of those resources. We took a look at some of the best practices. This is a reiteration of what I mentioned earlier. Make sure that you've got the correct criteria to scale something out, and more importantly, to scale things back in. Take a look at that cooldown period, and you don't want to have a cooldown number, a scale in number that's very close to the scale at number. I use that 70% and 50%. If I doubled the capacity and brought 2 units that were at 70% and no additional work comes in, they're immediately going to drop to 35%, spreading that load across the 4 units that you now have. Well, that's going to create a race condition to say, if less than 50%, to take those 2 away. So you want to monitor those kind of conditions. But all of those I've talked about, the books are catching up and showing you that there are some best practices that I did mention that you can now read about. So let's take a look at the knowledge check. And how would you describe autoscaling? You can pause the recording if you want for just a minute. So welcome back. There's not one definition of autoscaling. Autoscaling is a way for you to have a predictive pattern based around days of the week, days of the year, or potentially just some metric value that says, I don't know what it's going to be, but if we all of a sudden appear on some celebrity's favorite list and drive a whole bunch of traffic to our network, we want to be able to respond to that. So it is a way for a business to be able to respond to both predicted and unpredicted resource requirements. Question number 2, can you describe a condition that is a suitable candidate for autoscaling? Welcome back. Now I've given you a couple of examples. So both in the predicted and the unpredicted environment. So in a predicted pattern of what are your predicted days of busyness? When do you have something from a day of the week or the day of the year? And then another suitable candidate might be for a need for unpredicted growth requirements, so that if you had a burst of traffic that you could meet. But any one of those, there's no one specific answer that would all be good candidates. So part of the app service plans and the app services that run in those app service plans, we've now seen a way to be able to respond to demand. And especially in that auto-scaling capability in microservices, we are now going to be able to control specific portions of our application to respond to customer needs of those resources. And so we've now seen that we can now auto-scale our resources out and in. We can scale them up if they're being oversubscribed from an individual user requirement perspective. So it gives you this real flexibility without being bound to a set of resources such as a virtual machine that would require a redeployment of a bigger virtual machine that takes a while. You have to then provision it. Then you're stuck with the resources that were allocated. And so this provides for immediate requirements and upgrading or downgrading based on your needs that you're working with. Auto-scaling rules can be based on the web apps themselves that run in the app service plan. So there's a decoupling. The app service plan enables scaling, and it's the apps within the app service plan that will then create the criteria of when to scale them out and when to scale them back in. So thank you for joining me in this module. I look forward to seeing you in a future recording.